April 1945, deep within the heart of Germany. The smoke of battle hangs thick in the air, the sounds of artillery still echoing in the distance. Amidst the chaos of war, a group of female prisoners of war, exhausted, battered, but defiant, are herded through a desolate countryside. The sight before them is something they never imagined possible, a convoy of American trucks and tanks driven not by men, but by women. Their faces are a mix of disbelief and awe. These women, some no older than they are, command the heavy machinery with a confidence that seems to defy the brutal world they live in. To the female POWs, this scene is a testament to the shifting tides of war, a world they no longer recognize, where everything, even the roles of women, has been forever changed. The year 1945 marked the final phase of a global conflict that had consumed much of the world. For women, particularly those from occupied territories or fighting in the resistance, W-2000 had been an era of unimaginable trials. Many were forced into labor, while others found themselves on the front lines, not as soldiers but as spies, nurses, and workers in munitions factories. Among them were the women who would end up as prisoners of war. Captured during the war's numerous battles in Europe and the Pacific, they faced an uncertain fate. The conditions for female POWs were grueling, marked by harsh treatment, overcrowded camps, and a constant struggle for survival. However, amid the suffering, there was a growing sense of defiance. For these women, the war had opened doors to opportunities that had once been reserved only for men, even as the horrors of captivity threatened to undo them. What many of them could not have known was that back in the United States, women were gradually being integrated into roles once deemed unfit for them, roles that would soon challenge their preconceived notions of what it meant to be a woman in wartime. By 1943, as the demands of war escalated, the U.S. military began to recognize the crucial role women could play in supporting the war effort. The creation of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC, was a landmark moment. Women were recruited to serve in non-combatant roles, working as clerks, telephone operators, and cooks. Yet as the war's needs grew, so did the scope of their involvement. By 1944, women were being trained to take on more physically demanding jobs, including driving trucks and operating heavy machinery. In factories and on the assembly lines, women became the backbone of wartime production. These women were not just maintaining the war effort, they were integral to its success. Still, few could have imagined how these contributions would eventually shift the perception of women in warfare. As the war progressed and the need for manpower on the front lines intensified, the U.S. military made an unprecedented decision. They would not only employ women in supportive roles, but they would integrate them into combat logistics. The U.S. Army established the Women's Army Corps, WAC, where women were trained in a variety of fields, including mechanics, radio operation, and even truck driving. These women were tasked with the crucial job of maintaining and driving military vehicles, trucks, jeeps, and even the mighty tanks that were essential for the war effort. It was a practical decision made out of necessity, but it would change the course of history. One of the most significant shifts in military tactics was the increasing use of women to operate vehicles that had once been considered the exclusive domain of men. The idea of women behind the wheel of military trucks and tanks was, to many, a radical departure from traditional gender norms. Yet the reality of war left little room for outdated perceptions. Women drove convoys that supplied vital equipment to soldiers at the front, and they drove tanks into battle, with deadly precision and an unwavering commitment to the mission. The sight of a woman commanding a tank or navigating a convoy was one that captured the imagination and challenged societal boundaries. As American forces advanced into Europe and the Pacific, these women demonstrated their capability in roles that had been unimaginable a few short years prior. In the heat of battle, they did not simply serve as drivers. They became symbols of resilience and strength. The resistance they encountered was not just from the enemy, but from within their own ranks, as many male soldiers struggled to accept the presence of women in combat zones. Yet, as the war neared its end, the success of women in these roles could not be denied. They had proven themselves not just as capable soldiers, but as essential contributors to the war effort. The deployment of women into these combat-related roles was not just a necessity born out of wartime exigency. It marked the beginning of a profound cultural shift. The war had forever altered the way women were perceived, not only in the military but in society at large. Women, once relegated to the home front, were now driving the machinery of war, proving that they were not just a support system but active, indispensable participants in the fight for freedom. For the women held captive in POW camps, the sight of American women driving trucks and tanks was more than just an unexpected revelation. It was a jarring moment that forced them to confront the evolving role of women in the war. Many of these prisoners were from occupied countries such as France, Poland, and the Soviet Union, where women had already played pivotal roles in resistance movements. Yet the image of an American woman confidently steering a tank or maneuvering a heavy military truck was a dramatic departure from anything they had witnessed. At first, the POWs struggled to comprehend the full scope of what they were seeing. For years, women had been largely absent from the front line, relegated to traditional roles of caregiving and domestic work. Now they were not only participants in the war effort, but they were holding positions of power and authority. The shock was compounded by the fact that these women were Americans, citizens of a country that was often seen as the beacon of traditional gender roles. Yet here they were, defying those very norms and demonstrating extraordinary resilience in the face of war. For the female prisoners, this scene symbolized a deeper shift, not just in their perception of gender roles, but in the very structure of the war itself. It was no longer simply about defeating an enemy. It was about a new understanding of what women could achieve under extreme circumstances. For many of the POWs, the sight of American women in combat roles also served as a powerful reminder of the contrast between their own oppression and the freedom their captors enjoyed. The women behind the wheel of the trucks and tanks were not just fighting for their country. They were challenging centuries-old ideas about women's capabilities. Their courage on the battlefield had a profound effect on the POWs, forcing them to reckon with their own perceptions of gender and power in a war that had already altered the world in ways they never could have imagined. The deployment of women in combat roles during WW was not just a social experiment. It was a necessary strategic decision that contributed significantly to the Allied war effort. As the war escalated, the need for every available soldier, mechanic, and driver became critical. The U.S. military recognized that women, many of whom were highly skilled and capable, could serve in roles vital to the logistics and operational support of the fighting forces. Women in the WAC were trained to drive military vehicles, including trucks that carried essential supplies to the front lines, as well as larger, more complex machinery like tanks. Their role in maintaining the flow of resources, particularly during the brutal campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, was indispensable. A tank, after all, was a machine that needed constant upkeep, and women were stationed in units tasked with ensuring that these vehicles were battle-ready. In the heat of battle, the presence of women driving tanks was both a tactical necessity and a morale booster. These women, trained to handle some of the most demanding military equipment, showed that there were no limits to their potential. They weren't just fulfilling roles, they were actively shaping the course of the war. On many occasions, their role extended beyond mere transportation. They drove armored convoys through hostile territory, often facing direct fire from enemy forces. They demonstrated courage, resilience, and tactical awareness that were no less impressive than their male counterparts. The integration of women into these military roles also had a profound impact on the strategies employed by the Allies. The presence of women in tanks and behind the wheels of military vehicles not only augmented the logistical capabilities of the U.S. military, but also sent a powerful message to the Axis powers. The war was evolving in ways they had never anticipated. Women were no longer relegated to auxiliary roles. They were now essential to the success of military operations, demonstrating the tactical advantages of inclusion and the broadening of roles within the armed forces. The moment was surreal, almost cinematic. As the war wound down and American forces pushed further into German-occupied territory, a convoy of tanks, their engines rumbling like thunder, cut through the smoke and dust of a battlefield in Germany. At the head of one of these convoys was a woman, wearing the standard military uniform, her face a mixture of focus and determination. To the female prisoners of war watching from their camps, it felt like something out of a dream, a shocking deviation from everything they had known about women in war. These were women who, just a few years before, might have been expected to be cooking in a military kitchen or typing dispatches from a safe distance. But here they were, driving tanks into enemy territory. The sight of these American women in such commanding roles left the POWs in stunned silence. There was no doubting the intensity of the situation, but it was not just the battle they were witnessing. It was the changing of the guard, the erasure of old boundaries. For the female POWs, who had been subjected to the brutal and limiting constraints of their captors, this was an awakening. They had been powerless in the face of their captors' cruelty, but now they were seeing women, not just surviving but actively contributing to the defeat of the very forces that had held them captive. The contrast was not lost on them. The first encounters were filled with shock, disbelief, and for some, a touch of awe. The POWs watched in wonder as the American women, who had once been bound by similar societal limitations, drove massive war machines that tore through the landscapes they had once been confined to. They had no more illusions about the kind of world they were stepping into, one where women could be both warriors and survivors. And for the prisoners, this became a symbol of the world that was emerging from the ashes of war, a world in which women were no longer bound by the limitations imposed on them by society. One of the most defining moments came during the final stages of the war in Europe. As Allied forces closed in on Germany, they encountered intense resistance from the German military, which was desperately trying to slow their advance. In the midst of this chaos, women soldiers in the Women's Army Corps played a pivotal role in maintaining the momentum of the offensive. The role of women driving military trucks and tanks became particularly evident during the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944 and early 1945, despite being one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the war. Logistics remained a key factor in the Allied victory. Women, who were primarily assigned to transport supplies, ammunition, and personnel, showed extraordinary bravery as they maneuvered through treacherous, snow-covered terrain under constant threat of enemy fire. It was in these moments that the strength of these women was truly tested. They had to navigate broken roads and overcome weather conditions that had paralyzed entire divisions. The tanks, driven by women of the WAC, were at the front lines, pushing through to relieve their comrades and carry out crucial offensives. In one particular instance, a female tank commander and her crew were credited with taking out a German anti-tank unit that had been wreaking havoc on the American lines. They accomplished this with precision, timing, and unwavering focus in a scenario where failure could have meant disaster. In the Pacific Theater, similar moments of valor unfolded. Women were not just operating vehicles but engaging in combat situations that tested their resolve. In the Philippines, for example, the WAC women helped to keep supply lines open as American forces made their final push to defeat Japanese troops. Women drove trucks filled with vital resources to the front, enduring airstrikes, ambushes, and constant threats. The sight of women in these roles, operating in some of the most dangerous areas of the war, was a testament to how far women had come in the wartime effort and how essential their presence had become in achieving victory. These women were not mere bystanders in the war. They were active participants in decisive moments that shaped the outcome of battles and the course of history. Their contributions in the heat of battle were critical in maintaining the flow of resources and supplies to the front, ensuring that the troops had what they needed to keep fighting. In many ways, these women were the unseen warriors, the ones whose determination and courage often went unrecognized, but whose impact could not be overstated. As the war came to a close, the contributions of women in combat roles began to garner the recognition they had long deserved. The impact of women driving trucks and tanks, roles once unimaginable for women, was felt both on the battlefield and in the broader military strategy. The United States had won the war, but this victory was not only achieved through traditional combat roles but also through the essential logistical support and operational success enabled by women. The integration of women into active military roles proved that gender was not an obstacle to effective military strategy. The women who drove trucks across perilous terrains or operated tanks under fire had done more than just support their male counterparts. They had helped turn the tide of battle. Their participation ensured that the Allied forces could maintain critical supply lines, keep morale high, and counter enemy advances. Their presence on the battlefield became a powerful symbol of the changing times. breaking down long-held assumptions about gender and capability in warfare. For the military, this shift was far more than a symbolic victory. It was a practical one. The U.S. Army recognized that the contributions of women in these vital combat support roles were indispensable to the successful execution of its strategies. The role of women in the WAC and other auxiliary services had proven so effective that their participation in future military conflicts would be considered not just a matter of necessity but one of strategic advantage. However, the full extent of their role would not be truly understood until after the war, when the question of women's roles in the post-war military and society would come to the forefront. As the dust of war began to settle, the immediate aftermath brought with it a new wave of reflection. For the women who had driven those trucks and tanks, the sense of accomplishment was both deeply personal and collective. They had proved their capability on the battlefield, shattering the perception that women could not participate in the harshest and most demanding aspects of war. However, their victory was not without its complexities. The military, which had reluctantly opened these roles to women out of necessity, now had to reconcile with the idea that their success had been indispensable to the Allied victory. In the months following the war, there was a shift in military policy regarding women's roles. Many of the women who had served in the WAC, or who had driven tanks, found that the post-war military was eager to return to its pre-war status quo. Many were discharged, and the expectation was that women would return to their traditional roles at home. Yet this idea was met with resistance. Women, having proven themselves under the most difficult of circumstances, were not so easily willing to relinquish their newfound independence. The war had changed them. It had reshaped their identities and perceptions of what they could accomplish. Many found ways to stay involved in military work, albeit in different capacities. For the female POWs, the aftermath was a sobering moment of realization. They had been freed, but the world they returned to was not the same one they had left behind. The sight of American women operating military machinery had become a symbol of the immense transformation that had taken place. It also served as a reminder of the roles women had played in the war on both sides. For many POWs, this was a painful contradiction. While they had witnessed firsthand the suffering and brutality of captivity, the American women they saw driving tanks represented a different side of the war, one where women were not just victims but agents of change. The memory of those American women in trucks and tanks remained vivid in the minds of the prisoners long after they had been liberated. It was a constant reminder of how the war had upended every expectation, transforming not just the men who fought, but the women who had taken on new daring roles, proving that they, too, could wield power and change the course of history. The impact of women in wartime roles, particularly in the demanding and dangerous fields of truck and tank driving, echoes far beyond the immediate results of World War II. It was a pivotal moment in the history of gender roles, one that forever altered perceptions of what women could achieve. The battlefield, once a domain strictly reserved for men, became a space where women proved their resilience, skill, and determination. As we look back, it is clear that the war did more than just shape the future of nations. It reshaped the very fabric of society. The women who drove tanks and trucks were not merely filling a gap in manpower. They were standing as symbols of defiance, challenging the boundaries of tradition and illustrating the potential for progress. Their participation was not simply a victory for women's rights, but a testament to the power of necessity and the undeniable strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern warfare, where the question of gender and capability is no longer a limitation but a strength. The events of those years serve as a reminder that history is constantly evolving, and in the most unlikely of places, amidst the destruction of war, society can take its most significant steps toward change. The women who defied the conventions of their time not only helped to secure victory, but also laid the foundation for future generations, ensuring that their contributions would never be forgotten.